Alan joined the faculty at the University of Wisconsin in August of 1981. And he served originally as chair of the Department of Continuing and Vocational Education, which eventually merged with the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis. He also has served as the chair of the UW-Madison Teaching Academy. In a rather daunting task it was, actually, to read through and decide what to share with you about Professor Knox's career, which has spanned, amazingly, 6 decades. Alan has built a national and international reputation as an expert in adult education. His major research projects have focused on a number of topics, including the education for less advantaged adults, non-college bound young adults and participants in adult basic education, organizational analysis, adult development during young adulthood, appraisal of the needs of professionals for continuing education, the stability, effectiveness, and modifiability of learning strategies of adults. And current research and writing is focused on comparative adult education, continuing adult education leadership, and on helping adults learn. Professor Knox frequently lectures and consults internationally, including talks and workshops across the globe. Argentina, I would like this passport, actually. Argentina, Canada, China, Greece, Japan, India, Israel, Poland, Russia, the United Kingdom, and Yugoslavia. And in fact, in the 80s, he had a Fulbright research grant in Yugoslavia. And between 1986 and 92, he directed the World Perspective Comparative Study of Educational Programs for Adults in many countries throughout the world. Each year, as you can imagine with that kind of a resume, Professor Knox serves as an advisor to a variety of organizations and projects, including the Association of American Medical Colleges, the National University Continuing Education Association, UNESCO, AID, and the Dublin Institute of Adult Education. Professor Knox is also past president of the American Association for Adult and Continuing Education. And today we are privileged to have him share with us his presentation entitled Transcendent Leadership. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Knox.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to our discussion during this session in a number of ways. And Paul Bredesen and Al Phelps did such an outstanding job in laying the groundwork for the framework and the foundation for what I would say that all I need to do really is to provide a sort of postlude to the many ideas that they mentioned with which I agree. I'd like to pull out just a couple of themes in that regard, and the handout that I provided indicates some of the topics we may touch on at some point, but it depends upon your interest in some of those as well. Clearly, the title of the comment having to do with transcendent leadership is a sort of a curious notion, to be sure. We know very well that people interested in educational leadership are well versed with many of the adjectives that have gone along with really good leadership in one way or another, and they include such notions as servant leadership and comprehensive leadership for learning and strategic leadership, and the list goes on. Why do we need, we don't, why do we need any other adjective to go along with that? Well, let me provide a little explanation for why I need it. You don't need it, I need it, because it helps to, for me anyway, to remind myself of something that many people on this campus know very well. And that is people who are doing very good work in various aspects of educational leadership tend to focus on what they care about and what they know about a good deal. And my notion of transcendent leadership is that a small percentage, perhaps, of people who are engaged in leadership, trying to do the very best job they can in terms of administration, instructional leadership, and so on, in their particular setting, a small percentage of them, I think, benefit from having a somewhat broader, transcendent perspective on what they're doing. Well, transcendent in what sense? It sounds a little bit like a religious or spiritual notion, to be sure. Transcendent. What is transcendent? Well, it's above what you're doing. Many times people are concerned in such leadership positions that when they were trying to do what they want to do, like clear the swamp of alligators or something of the sort, that what was their mission, what was their vision of what they wanted to do when they're dealing with the pressing concerns hour after hour, day after day. Some of the studies having to do with the amount of time that most administrators spend in doing whatever it is that they do in the course of a day, it's like, what, 7 or 8 minutes? It's the people who have looked at a sort of a diary level of how much time is spent. Well, if you're spending, on the average, 7 or 8 minutes, if you spend an hour or so on a given task, it means you've got a lot of tasks that are very specific and demanding in a number of ways that are shorter than 7 minutes. And so that time pressure and the immediate concerns, as important as they are, make it difficult to think of some of the big thoughts that Paul and Al referred to before that are so important to inform what people are doing. And so the notion of transcendent leadership, it seems to me, is the importance not only for the people who are ready, willing, and able to devote the time and attention to that larger view of what's going on, but also to share that transcendent perspective that they have with the other people with whom they are working in order to help them to gain some vision of that larger notion. Well, as has already been pointed out, having some sense of where we've come from, and I share Paul and Al's notion of not taking for granted the experience here in Wisconsin and before over the years, and the benefits that I've gained from that, but having some sense of where we've come from and where the field has come from and where the individual people, practitioners for the most part with whom we're working, their past experience is an important part of that, as well as dealing with the immediate concerns of the present, because people in leadership positions as professionals and everywhere are not practicing whatever it is they do in general or from the textbook. As has already been pointed out, they do so by paying attention to the specific issues that are involved, the specific patient, client, student, customer, whatever the case may be, whose attention is important to them and where it deserves their full attention right then. And so being aware of the past and the present is very important. And I would submit that, as has already been pointed out, having some sense of where things seem to be going, what are desirable directions for the future, are also important as well. And it's that future orientation that's particularly important to me, and some of my comments are going to address. The other notion that's already been pointed out has to do with taking into account the multiple places where educational leadership occurs. It occurs obviously in elementary and secondary schools, and it occurs in community colleges and universities, but it also, as Al's comments particularly pointed out, it occurs in enterprises where people work after they complete that period of full-time formal education. It occurs in associations, professional associations particularly, where lifelong learning and a concern for continuing to learn and change and deal with the challenges is a part of what's entailed. It occurs in all sorts of community agencies where adults throughout their lifespan have opportunities to learn and many opportunities to do so. And the articulation between those two is an important part, it seems to me, of transcendent leadership, of having some concern of where people are coming from and where they're going on either side of the particular setting within which that's occurring. I'm also impressed with how much increasingly what's going on in other parts of the world is important in terms of what we're doing today. and what we might be doing in the future. And so it's one thing to use global or international or some other terminology to refer to that, but what are we learning comparatively in terms of similarities and differences between what's happening in our setting in Wisconsin, in the United States, or throughout the world? How can that sort of comparative perspective help to inform what we're doing now and tomorrow in some fashion? Now, the people who are providing educational leadership of a transcendent sort, as again, has already been pointed out beautifully in the main presentations for this afternoon leading up to this proscript, has to do with the different settings within which learning occurs. It occurs on a sort of one-to-one basis in which people as a counselor, as a mentor, being concerned with on-the-job training and working with colleagues in one setting or another, that's part of not just the classroom, not just the formal situation in which learning occurs, but recognizing how much of learning occurs on an individualized basis, self-directed by the individual, orchestrated to some degree within a community of practice or within the workplace or within the family or neighborhood or other places where learning might occur. It also occurs, to be sure, in groups of various sorts, but also, again, as has been pointed out by Paul in terms of leadership within a school or community college or other educational institution. Alice pointed out in terms of learning in the workplace as well as in educational institutions. That process of learning in an organizational context is also part of what occurs, it seems to me, in terms of transcendent educational leadership. Because even though you may want to focus on one of those, the rest of it's going on. And you can take into account and you can build on it and you can chain together some of those opportunities or not. And increasingly, learning is taking place in the neighborhood, in the community, in the larger geographic areas. People are trying to learn from each other in a number of ways. What I'd like to do is to point out that transcendent educational leadership is especially important when you're moving away from some of the relatively simple, straightforward situations in which learning occurs. If you're interested in learning something about an art or a craft, music or something of the sort, some sort of individualized instruction is called for, and somebody can coordinate a great deal of that without having to get very much involved in the details of it in some fashion. Many of the complexities that we've been thinking about this afternoon are not part of that. If you're mentoring one person, it's important to do it well, but you don't have to have an elaborate superstructure to be able to deal with the governance and the coordination of that and so on. And so you can think of many, and I've listed a few, sort of straightforward instances in which transcendent educational leadership isn't needed. You have to have able, well-meaning people who are trying to help somebody else learn, and that can occur along the line. I'm particularly interested, personally, and the notion of transcendent leadership in the more complex problems. As you think of the 1930s, when a sociologist from Sweden came to North America to try to understand something about an American dilemma. And that American dilemma had to do with race in America. And his formulation had to do with the theory of the vicious cycle. That complex problems like that are not going to be solved by doing something about voting rights, if that's all that happens. In doing something about educational opportunities, if that's all that happens. Or employment, or health, or housing, or a number of other things that are involved. Those problems, as been pointed out by Paul and by Al, are interconnected in a number of ways. And so there are other examples as well. When my wife and I were in Denmark some years ago, 2 or 3 decades ago, and the World Health Organization had indicated particular interest in heartbeat whales, an instance in which they're trying to do something about the inordinately high level of illness and death happening in relation to men, particularly in Wales. And they came up with a strategy, a multi-pronged strategy to do something about that problem. And what the solution was, finally, was a multi-pronged approach in which they dealt with patient education and public understanding to help people to understand something about how lifestyle and things that they were doing were contributing to that problem. But also that doing something with people who are providing as nurses and as physicians and other people in healthcare, the sort of understanding on their part to what they could be doing in terms of prevention, not just curing people after they got sick, but prevention to try to reduce that incident. But also to recognize that there were other folks who were involved in the workplace where people were buying food and recognizing heart-healthy options to include, something about what the media could be doing and so on. No one of those by themselves were likely to make a dent in the particular problem, but the combination of them stood a chance of doing so. One other example, a decade or so ago, Nan Carey and Harry Boyd and some other people in Twin Cities initiated the Jane Addams School for Democracy in the west side of St. Paul. This is in the last decade or two the equivalent of Ellis Island of a century ago in terms of the number and the diversity of people from all over the world who are coming to settle into that neighborhood. Think of what we all know from firsthand experience in some instances, from the media and so on, of what happens when you have people from very different language, cultural, religious, and other traditions living cheek by jowl in a neighborhood. Think of all of the violence and the problems that are created for everybody. For the residents there, for the police, for the social workers, for the people who work in schools and community colleges and so on. The story, however, of what's happened over the last decade is an inspiring one. And Nan Carey and her colleague, Nan Skelton, a few years ago, published a little book called Voices of Hope, in which they told that story. And they did so in part by the little chapters and photographs that they authored, plus dozens of other people who've been involved in that neighborhood over that period of time. Because the basic notion that Nan Carey particularly, who's been the spearhead of that effort, brought from the Jane Addams settlement house in Chicago as a prototype for the Jane Addams School for Democracy, was that it's at the neighborhood level that this needs to be addressed in some fashion, not just the individual level or the institutional level and so on, but at the level of the individual neighborhood. To be able to provide easy vehicles for people to get to know each other, to come to respect and trust each other, to be part of a community, part of a neighborhood learning community. And in that context, to recognize that you have to provide some opportunities for people to get to know each other, because cooperation doesn't occur without trust. Trust doesn't occur without some sort of acquaintance and becoming familiar with who those other people are. And so some way of promoting that sort of interchange in a very difficult circumstance. One of the impediments to that is that if people are dumped into a relatively low rent neighborhood of some sort, by definition, they don't have much money, they don't have much social capital, they don't have many of the ingredients that help other people in a community setting to get to know each other, to interact, to cooperate in some fashion. And so one of the things that they did in just the first few years was to provide subsidized, inexpensive transportation. So people in that neighborhood could be able to go out to a street corner and get on something, a little bus, a small bus, and get off where they wanted to and not have the problems of cost and distance keep them from going where they wanted to go. Another was to provide some sort of forum so that people who were interested in getting to know their neighbors and to find out what they had to share could be able to do so, and to formalize that in such a way that with interest and access, people could get together and talk from their standpoint, not do you want to participate in our programs that a dozen higher education institutions, community education effort within the schools and community education effort within Minnesota generally were providing, but to initiate, to indicate what they would like to share as well as what they'd like to give. And so one of the catchphrases relatively soon was, everybody's a learner, everybody's a teacher. All right, who's everybody? Well, everybody includes the grandparents who are living there and the parents and the children, the grandchildren, within families, because in many instances, people were coming from other parts of the world with multi-generational family. And not surprisingly, it was the grandchildren who were the ones who were most quickly learning English, learning to deal with technology, learning to get around and so on, the mobility, all the rest of it. So they were in a position of being, in a sense, a teacher to their parents or their grandparents in instances where they were the ones, as grandchildren, who understood some of the key ideas of how to make the adjustment to where they were living. And furthermore, some of the grandchildren in the school situation were beginning to recognize from that community learning activity that it was in a degree empowering to them, and began to go to some of the teachers and principals in their local school to say, we're doing things to make it better for us in our neighborhood and so on, but the restrooms here are awful. Isn't there something that could be done with that? And fortunately, a principal or assistant principal or something of the sort said, great idea. What would you like to help do something about that? Rather than saying, well, it's your problem, you turn it over to the custodians and do it. What could you do about it? And so they began to initiate within the school some notions of what they could do, some of the peer pressure and cooperation and demonstrating what might be done, so that little by little they began to see that there was an empowerment occurring from interaction with other people in that situation and so on. And with the combination of what I've just described so far, more and more people in that neighborhood began to say, well, I could do something in terms of bringing food to an event, food that I'm familiar with and is important in terms of my own past and so on. And so sharing a meal with other people in the neighborhood, people who are strangers and so on, is one way. Somebody else will say, well, many of us have clothing and other fabrics and so on that we're familiar with and we're making and we're brought with us and so on. We could share some of that as well and so on. And stories and other ideas and others ways of getting to know each other and so on. So when you get to know each other as people, not as the other, not as strangers in some way, but as people, and begin to develop a sense of trust and cooperation there and so on, it opens doors for a broader way of thinking collectively and so on. So those are the sorts of examples that particularly interest me, because in enterprises and in various professions, and I'm particularly interested in helping professions where caring is central to what you do, and health occupations and teaching and learning and educational leadership and a number of others are preeminent in that regard, where helping and caring is a part of what's entailed in doing your job as a professional. And so, as I say, I'm interested in those instances where particularly where people within a profession are concerned about change and improvement of what's going on, and to recognize that many of the practices that have been occurring in many professional fields over a long period of time have emphasized a presentation, instruction, a relatively usual formal educational way of thinking about teaching and learning, where people who know a lot about a topic explain that to some people who don't know. And when they have successfully done so, to feel good about what has been done. But after several decades of doing research and evaluation having to do with continuing professional education in the health professions, finally the conclusions were so clear that that doesn't bring about any change in what actually happens in practice. You can just explain to people till you're blue in the face and practice your instructional mode of teaching and learning, and it doesn't make any difference in practice for a whole bunch of reasons that many of us understand very well. So what do you need to do? Well, one of the things that's very helpful is to think in terms of quality improvement and the way in which, going back to Deming and World War II and Japanese industry and all the rest of it, pointed out, as Paul has in his book on the architecture of educational leadership and change and so on, that in order to change, in order to have improvement occur in an organizational setting, requires that everybody sees that as their job. There has to be an acceptance that improvement, quality improvement, is everybody's job. And if you're taking people, in a sense, out of the work situation and instructing them about something, then they run the risk of coming back to that work situation and other people say, fine, I'm glad you had a good experience there and so on, but please don't make waves. We've seen this sort of enthusiasm of somebody who's discovered better ways of doing something and coming back and telling us about it and so on and before. It requires patience. You just have to have patience for that fad to run its course in the next 2 or 3 years and so on, and then we can continue to do what we've been doing anyway in the past. All right, if instruction doesn't do it, what does? Well, one of the contributors that Al's comments dealt with very much is performance. You start with what people are doing, and you get young people or middle-aged people or older people involved in doing what needs to be done, and in the context of performance and trying to improve that performance and so on, there is a chance of making an improvement. And people in health professions, again, have a long history of preceptors or clinical experiences or way of trying to build in the sort of workplace learning or the equivalent through simulation or something of the sort for people at any stage of their life to be able to better understand how things work and what they can do differently and have the sort of coaching or assistance. And on-the-job training is probably half of all of the education and training and change that occurs in enterprises of all sorts. If it's going to occur, half of it occurs through sort of coaching. I'll demonstrate what needs to be done. I'll let you help a little bit. I'll coach you to some degree. And at some point, I'll say to you, you're doing fine. You've incorporated in what you're doing right now the good ideas that I have to pass along and so on. You know where to find me if you have a question or you want additional help. The third ingredient, it seems to me, along with instruction and performance as vehicles for teaching and learning, has to do with inquiry, has to do with research and evaluation, has to do with the various ways in which people try to discover for themselves answers to the questions that they have. And so being in a situation where people are encouraged to ask questions, to be dissatisfied with the way in which things have been working, and to want to find better ways of doing it is the start. Isn't that what research is all about? Many times we talk about the research-oriented university and what they're doing and so on, And historically, faculty members, researchers, other people who are doing research understand that very well because they are the ones who are inquiring. The slowness that's tended to occur many times in the silos is that people assume that that's something that you can only do when you reach a certain level of mastery, without realizing that opportunities for undergraduate students to be involved in learning activities, service learning activities in a laboratory or in some other research setting and so on, is a neat way to do something about undergraduate education. And the same sort of thing in secondary school and so on. One of the features, again, with a lifelong learning orientation right now throughout the lifespan, is for people to realize that you have two jobs. One is to do your job, and the other one is to learn how to do it better. And that's inquiry. And that's something that if you embrace that as a part of what goes with the territory, there's a chance then of bringing about some substantial change in what actually happens in practice. Now, one of the interests that I have, as Julie referred to before, has to do with inquiry and evaluation and so on. And clearly, the use of evaluation, ongoing evaluation, and I turned to John afterwards and said, do you think Al believes in evaluation? In terms of the extent to which ongoing evaluation was shot through almost every single slide that he provided there. And so the notion of asking people to make explicit evaluative judgments about what they were doing, about what they wanted to be doing, to make it explicit, put it on the table, sort of like double loop learning, questioning what the question is as well as the answer that you're getting, to see that as a part of what needs to be done in some fashion. So that's sort of building in evaluation as a part of guiding the decisions that people are making along the line, rather than something that only occurs at the end of the unit, only at the end of the course, or sometimes partway through, et cetera. But to see evaluation, inquiry in a number of ways as a theme running all the way through. Well, let me come back then to the notion of transcendent leadership. What would somebody do in any setting throughout the lifespan, internationally as well as domestically, as well as within Wisconsin, as well as with one urban school? What would it take then for somebody to provide transcendent leadership? And I would submit it would take some understanding on their part of the connections, the relationships that occur between what's occurring in the specific instance, where attention to the job is very, very important, but it's some way or other, either it's reflection on learning or reflection in learning or something, that there's some reflection going on about connections between what you're trying to do in this situation and what other people have been doing in the past, are currently doing, are trying to do in the future in some fashion. To realize that there are people in many different settings, as the couple that I have alluded to here, who are involved in related activities from which you can learn in some fashion and can enrich your own understanding of that larger perspective and the connections that are involved, and to begin to see that, yes, you need to concentrate on the immediate task at hand under the circumstances, but also have some way of opening up a window to not only past and present and future, but also to other settings where analogous activities are going on and where your experience could be enriched by understanding the similarities and differences as well. One of the activities that I've involved in this last relatively few months has to do with public health nurses and what they're doing throughout the state of Wisconsin. And for the last 5 years, a major professional development activity going on for people who are public health nurses and how they relate to schools of nursing, which up until 5 years ago was not a great deal. Schools of nursing needed to place their nursing students out for some sort of practicum experience with a public health nurse, and they needed to have some preceptor there who would work with that nurse and so on. So there was that connection, but it wasn't much deeper than that in a number of ways. But also, public health nurses are working in a very specific setting, and they relate to lots of other people, not only health professionals and the people who are concerned with a local county or city health department and so on, but the people whose lives they're trying to help in some way, the patients, if you will, the families, and an effort within the public health nursing effort to get people to look at not just individual patients and not just patients in their family neighborhood context, but that larger community as well, and to think in terms of some more collective effort. And so that notion of looking more broadly than the student and parents to that larger concern for community education and the ways in which other people in that larger geographic area, community, however defined, neighborhood, the school district and the people who are there, people who vote on bond issues and similar things, to see that as a part of the agenda and to see some of the effective ways in which people who are focusing on those other parts, thinking of the Heartbeat Wales effort, how the media and how people who are working with parents and people who are working with social workers and the police and so on could be part of a multi-pronged effort to make a difference in what happens in that neighborhood in some fashion. And so that perspective, it seems to me, is very valuable for people who are trying to provide a transcendent perspective on what's occurring, rather than just doing the best job they can in their own little bailiwick, in their own silo in some fashion. Another aspect of a transcendent perspective, it seems to me, has been picked up already in terms of shared leadership or other ways in which you recognize that leadership, as Paul nicely pointed out, is not a person, it's a process. You don't have leadership without followership, and you don't have leadership and the sort of complex problems we're talking about without collaboration. And collaboration requires people who would cooperate with each other to share some values having to do with the intended outcomes, the goal, the shared values that are important for people to cooperate on any level, particularly ongoing collaboration in some fashion. There needs to be some sort of complementarity in the contributions that people are making, because if everybody wants to give and get exactly the same things, it's hard to get collaboration, really. It's the complementarity many times that makes the difference as to whether ongoing collaboration occurs. People who are working in higher education settings many times find people in enterprises, people in professional associations as great to collaborate with, because each of them wants what the other one is willing to provide. And so that's good for partnership. And there have to be shared benefits. There have to be ways in which people who are going to have a sustainable collaborative relationship are going to continue to do so. Not a situation where one or more of the so-called partners get all of the goodies, all of the desirable outcomes, and the rest of them are sort of shortchanged until they finally decide, I don't need this anymore, and decide they're not going to continue in that collaboration. So I'm trying to suggest then some of the ways in which we can learn from each other across the many silos that occur, having to do with educational leadership and taking into account not only the settings and what we can learn from each other, but the benefits that come from collaboration and working together in some fashion. So that is the message that I have in mind. I would welcome, in the time that fortunately is still remaining, to entertain any of your thoughts or your examples or questions having to do with transcendent leadership. Okay, floor is open. Al.
You brought in the teaching academy. I mean, I think one of the great things about Madison is that teaching and learning is a central part of what everybody does. I mean, people don't come here to do nursing research or, do stem cell research. They also come here to teach and learn. I think it has huge implications when we think about the mission of leadership in, the ELPA graduate program. And what are the things that you hope the ELPA graduate program can continue to provide so that it provides this transcendent leadership opportunity for people who come here to be, medical educators or who come here to be social work educators?
One of them very clearly, referring to the Teaching Academy, is that for 20 years now, it's brought together people from many of the departments and colleges across campus who are particularly interested in teaching and learning. It's called the Teaching Academy, but as you pointed out, it's concerned with teaching and learning. And for the first 6 years of that, I, for some strange reasons, read every single application for people who wanted to be fellows in the Teaching Academy. And the thing that struck me is the high percentage of people who said, in effect, I'm one of the few people in my department who cares about teaching and learning. It is so lonely here. Furthermore, every time I turn to a colleague in my department to say something about that, I am told, don't say anything about that to anybody. It's a sign of weakness. It will damage your ability for promotion and tenure, for people to take you seriously, because they'll assume that you're doing that as a consolation prize because you don't have the vision of the research you want to do, the publications you have, and so on. And so I'd like to be part of a larger community of people who care about that. And furthermore, it's probably safer for me to do that in a campus level unit than with some of my own colleagues in my department. Now, to turn to the part of your question saying, what could ELPA do in that regard? I'm disappointed, quite frankly, that not only ELPA, but a number of other departments in the School of Education have so few people who are active in providing leadership at the Teaching Academy. What better laboratory, what better opportunity to serve, what better way to learn about what's going on across, think of the disciplines that you were dealing with in your study, to learn across those disciplines. And yet it's tough to get people to be willing to do that and to stay with it for more than just a short period of time. There's a tendency to take the honor and run to some degree and not spend 3 to 6 years continuing to work along. Now, there are some people in psych and a number of other departments who have continued and are currently providing leadership in that regard. But it's sort of strange that the one place on campus you'd assume to have the highest level of interest and commitment and ability to contribute would be the School of Education, and yet much of the leadership has occurred elsewhere. Furthermore, I've been working with the medical school and nursing and so on regarding trying to do some things to supplement the Teaching Academy effort to try to encourage more people in the health sciences to get involved and to learn from that experience. And when we took a list of about 40 people with whom the Faculty Development Advisory Committee of the med school, on which I've been serving for a few years, to ask them if they would be interested in having somebody, me, to visit with them on the phone for 15 or 20 minutes about their teaching and what they're doing and so on. To have me come and just observe what they're doing in teaching in lots of different situations, in grand rounds and one-on-one, as well as more formal med school or something of the sort, what they do with residents and so on. Half of them responded within a short period of time, said, that'd be great. I'd be interested in doing that. When I gave the keynote for Med Ed Day in the spring, any number of people expressed interest and so on. And so there are many opportunities through campus to be able to help people to reflect on what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they'd like to be doing better, and so on, and to discover some of the good examples. I'm in hopes that with the examples that we've been assembling, and I'm pulling out articles on teaching and learning relevant to health sciences and so on generally, continuing professional education as well as med school and residencies and so on. To be able to add to the website, which is now virtually invisible within the medical school, examples of what people are doing, some of the questions, some of the resources that are available and so on, to try to raise the visibility of teaching and learning in some fashion. Now, what I've said in terms of Teaching Academy, it seems to me could apply to lots of other settings in terms of outreach efforts in the spirit of the Wisconsin idea for people who are working in community colleges and the schools, but in lots of other settings where educators are providing leadership for educational programs in enterprises and associations and community agencies and so on that are part of that larger mix that I referred to before. Thank you. Other comments or questions? Well, thank you for this opportunity.